All good things must come to an end, and so it is with this conference. So we're gonna start the swan song of MeCCSA 2019. And I'm very proud to present to you Professor Hannu Neiminen. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Professor of Media and Communications Policy at University of Helsinki. He received his master's degree in social studies in 1984 at University of Tampere, where he studied political science, sociology, journalism, and mass media. Before returning to academic life in the early 1990s, he worked as a student and peace movement organizer. He received his PhD in 1996 at the University of Westminster's Communication and Media Research Institute, CAMRI. In his doctoral dissertation, he compared Jürgen Habermas and Raymond Williams' historical accounts of the development of the public life in Britain and assessed their complementary views as well as differences in conceptualizing the role of communication in the process of democratization. Hannu maintains his close links to British academia to this day. He is a visiting fellow of the LSE as well as member of the External Advisory Board of the University of Westminster. Yesterday, during her keynote speech, Shuhini mentioned that Nordic countries rank very high on Media Freedom Index and are in more ways than one used as an example for many other countries to follow, including in terms of equality, welfare policies, informed citizenship, well-being, and security. Their top-performing media system is also sometimes called Nordic welfare media. In his keynote today, Hannu will challenge this idea of well-informed citizenship and well-functioning media model in the light of rising inequality and social polarization, xenophobia and ethnic polarization, and budget cuts affecting the most vulnerable in our society. His keynote is entitled "The Media and Informed Citizenship, Examining the Nordic Model." Without further ado, I present you Hannu Neiminen.
Dear colleagues and dear friends, first of all, I would very warmly like to thank organizers for inviting me here. I feel really honored. This is my first time in any MeCCSA event, and of course my first time in Stirling too. And I'm honestly very impressed. And many thanks to Alenka, of course, for her very kind words indeed. My aim in this speech is to look for explanations why and how the social role of the European media in relation to democracy is today as it is. This would require both and reconstructing traditional approaches to media history and linking them to the wider social, political and cultural developments. And this is what I at least try to start here. Regarding the title of my speech, The Media and Informed Citizenship, Examining the Nordic Model, I try to follow its conceptual framework. But it needs to be said that even within our Nordic research community, there is quite much critical debate if there exists or ever has existed a specific Nordic model, as there are quite significant historical differences between the countries. True enough, though, in European and even wider comparison, it is true that Nordic countries create a distinctive group. And there are several important similarities between the countries in relation to their media systems too. In my speech, I will first make a short introduction and pose some awkward questions concerning the Nordic media. I will then discuss some more about the media in general in the build-up of European modernity from the Nordic perspective. Thirdly, I will say something about what I call an epistemic turn in the Western world and how it has reflected in the Nordics, as we can say. And finally, I will present a normative two-level model to analyze the media today, and I will put forward arguments for a radical democratic reform of the European media policy. Just a slight warning, my speech includes quite a number of lists of things. I try to keep them short anyhow. Yes, just to remind you what is actually meant when referring to the Nordic countries. They are 5 altogether, consisting from 3 Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway and Sweden sharing closely related languages, plus then Iceland and Finland, whose languages are a bit more eccentric, if you like. These countries do share much history between them, but history divides them too. Today, some of them are NATO members, some are not. Some are European Union members, some are not. Some have euro as their currency, some not. And again, some are still monarchies, some are not. My starting point is what we can call the Nordic model of democracy. Ideally, we can present its central principles as follows. People recognized as citizens make choices and act on the basis of the best information available. They are equal in access and in the availability of information and knowledge. They are equally competent to process and understand information and knowledge and act upon it too. They have equal rights to express opinions and to be heard, and they share an equal right to personal privacy. The role of the media is central to democratic discussion. Not only that, but will formation and decision making. In other terms, the media have an epistemic function, that is, they provide and daily update the necessary knowledge and information that citizens need to be socially active. Global comparison, the Nordic model appears to be very successful. As mentioned, Nordic countries are on the top in nearly all main indicators related to citizens' equality and informed citizenry, as Shohini yesterday kindly emphasized in her keynote speech. As an example, actually, then, we can see in the World Press Freedom Index 2018, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, Finland, Switzerland. In Corruption Perceptions Index 2018, Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland. In Global Gender Gap Report 2018, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Nicaragua. And in the World Happiness Report 2018, Finland was the first. Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland. This is all good, and obviously there might be something that reflects the way things really are in these countries. But however, we can present equally relevant but starkly contrasting indicators. Increase in income inequality in the Nordic countries. This has been the case in all Nordic countries for a number of years. Declining social services, all countries have experienced cuts in social welfare, healthcare, education, pensions, students' allowances, and so on. Right-wing xenophobic parties advancing in elections. These parties do get today a share between 13 to 26%, and this seems to be increasing. Increasing political instability. For example, in Sweden, there has not been a government since September, when the parliamentary elections were held there. And fracturing social and cultural cohesion. There is increasing segregation in housing, education, and labor market, and so on. So based on these indicators, then, there seems to be a severe contradiction within the Nordic ideal of democracy. How come that the world's most equal and best informed citizenry seems to exercise similarly exclusive and discriminatory policies towards their fellow citizens as in any other less informed and less equal societies in Europe and other parts of the globe, to that matter? How can we accommodate this contradiction? I will focus here only on the role of the media, based on the assumption that the media are one of the main sources, if not the most important source, of information required for our daily actions. So my question then is, has our belief in the Enlightenment lost its ground? Does better knowledge and information not, after all, lead to more tolerance and equality? In principle, I think we have two possibilities here. Either the Nordic media systems function well and citizens are well informed, people make discriminating choices voluntarily and consciously on the basis of the best information. But of course we don't like this option, because we like to think that informed citizens make only good and right choices. Or then Nordic media systems don't function well and citizens are not actually well informed, people make those discriminating choices without full knowledge of their consequences, non-consciously then. I will then follow the latter trail of thought because it is more comfortable. So, to start from the more abstract level, from the European modernity. Just for the sake of clarity, when I'm talking about media in this presentation, I'm referring mostly to the fact-based contents or journalism in its different forms. And to fully understand the role of the media for and in our European modern societies, I will follow, although rather freely, Jürgen Habermas's approach, which then again follows the trail opened by, among others, Emil Durkheim, Thurgood Parsons, and others. According to them, one of the main characters of modernity is the differentiation of the areas or fields of social action. By this they mean that in the course of the development of European modernity, such previously tightly interwoven areas of social action as religion, arts, politics, economy, law, science, and so on, became increasingly separated from each other on functional basis. Some scholars, as Max Weber and Charles Taylor, refer to this as the process of secularization that basically describes the same family of things. In the process of differentiation, then, different logics of action and claims of validity emerged. Science was departed from religion, economy became separated from politics, and so on. What Habermas brought to this scholarly discussion was an update of the old concept of Öffentlichkeit, or as he called it, the bürgerliche Öffentlichkeit, the bourgeois public sphere. For him, the public sphere emerged historically as the principle of, the area for, and the means for coordination between different validity claims, or better, the social forces behind those claims. That the notion something like that, a or the public sphere, or the forum for public debate and opinion formation, that it took shape in Europe from around the 18th and 19th centuries, has since been shared by many social scholars, although often quite critically, as we well know, as Philip Schlesinger elegantly described in his keynote on Wednesday, there are today many differing accounts of its historical origins, of its character, and so on. Some of the most well-known critics have already been mentioned here in the conference, among them Nancy Fraser, Iris Marion Young, Chantal Mouffe, and others. But this is again a matter of another presentation. Here my topic is mostly the role of the media. In all cases, media, meaning the newspapers, magazines, radio, television, whatever, are historically seen as institutions functioning as arbiters in the building up of modern society, conceptualized within the framework of individual nation states, imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson called them. And again, following Professor Schlesinger and much debates here in different sessions, we can also say that the media has been and still is crucial in the creation of and sustaining nationally based epistemic communities in good and bad, creating and empowering shared identities between fellow citizens. Now, what was and still is characteristic then to the Nordic societies, is the specific way to modernity that separates them from the rest of Europe and that continues to affect the role and status that the media enjoy in these countries. The Danish sociologist Gösta Esping Andersen has presented an influential distinction between three models of welfare capitalism. First, liberal regimes that follow the Anglo-American model and are characterized by means testing and are targeted at low-income recipients. This type of welfare state encourages market solutions to social problems. Second, conservative regimes, which are typical to South Europe and are shaped by traditional family values and tend to encourage family-based assistance dynamics. And third, the social democratic regimes that refer mostly to the Nordic countries. In these, the welfare state represents an egalitarian and universalistic system based on decommodification of welfare services. And as we easily can see then, this threefold division matches to a great extent with the famous Hallin and Mancini's three models of European media systems, which we can then adopt rather freely to support our analysis too. Now, these different welfare regimes have also differences in relation to how the public sphere, or something like the public sphere, has historically been constructed in each of them. I focus here on the Nordic case and leave the two other regimes to some other occasion. So what emerged in the North Europe in the course of the 20th century were several things that defined the role of the media. As mentioned, the epistemic order was based on the ideal of universalism, in other words, on the belief of social and cultural equality of all citizens. Also, the institutional system, which was then based on the principle of Rechtsstaat, German word here in Nordic environment, or the rule of the law. That is the legal system that guarantees citizens' democratic rights. And then the state-sponsored, I think it is the right term, state-sponsored public sphere that was based on a wide network of public epistemic institutions, among them such as free education, cultural and artistic institutions, public libraries, also public subsidies to civil society organizations, quite large, widely, but also specific arrangements concerning the media, such as public service broadcasting from the 20s and 30s, state subsidies to newspapers, statutory freedom of information, and others. So ideally then, the Nordic welfare model aimed at producing a kind of democratic corporatist balance between different social, political, and cultural interest parties, or in other words, a social contract where all societal groups and classes could feel their interests, though often conflicting and even antagonistic, satisfied to a relatively acceptable degree. So I move now then to the third part of my presentation. From the early 80s to the mid 90s, something that I call an epistemic turn, or a transformation in the epistemic order, took place in Nordic societies. This was, of course, not very different from what happened about the same time in many other European countries, following the political trend that was started in the United Kingdom under the reign of our Margaret Thatcher, yours, sorry. And that became later labeled as neoliberalism. One of the central issues which still needs to be researched more thoroughly is how certain core concepts linked to the ideals of what makes a good society became suddenly redefined and turned almost upside down. By this I mean such concepts as what is taken as a fair and just social order. How do we understand the sources of inequality? How do we balance such values as economic efficiency against human dignity? It seems that within a relatively short period of time, the whole value hierarchy was changed. But this again is perhaps a subject for another continuing discussion. One of the central sources for the rise of neoliberalism, as often is noted, is the fact that the economic boom that started in the Western world after the Second World War, it started to slow down by the early 70s. New sources of capital accumulation were urgently needed, and all this affected the Nordic societies too, although perhaps some years later than in the United Kingdom and other Mid- and Central European countries. Developments such as globalization and digitalization became now labeled as new megatrends, promising us new means for and sources of economic growth and well-being. There were they were and still are closely intertwined with the processes of financialization of economy, or in other words, with the vast expansion of fictional and debt-based economy. This was now separated from the real economy, meaning that traditional ties between politics and economy became to a great degree done away, as recently discussed, among others, by sociologists such as Wolfgang Streeck, German socialist, and Colin Crowe, who are more familiar to this island, this part of the Europe. However, this was not all what happened. Another development was the process of commodifying intellectual work and knowledge, and its implications have been at least as fundamental as those listed above. In practice, this means that all different forms of symbolic and creative production in the spheres of arts, culture, education, science have eventually either already became or are in danger of becoming subsumed into the market's logic and commercialized, as David Hesmonhalgh, among others, has perspectively analyzed. We need only to look at universities to see the implications of this process. In the realm of the media, this all meant that privatization and commercialization became a dominant tendency also in Nordic media policy and regulation. Public service broadcasting became under heavy attack by the commercial media, especially on the basis of its distorting the media market. Like in other European countries, telecom companies were privatized and cartelized. In most countries today, only a few telecom companies are dominating the market. I would say it is at least semi-monopoly. State subsidies to newspapers were ruled illegal under the European competition law. It means that there is not really much left anymore from this public subsidy system. In Finland the least, in Sweden, in Norway a little bit more. The whole ethos of media policy changed from social and democratic aims and values towards commercial aims, from common good to private profit seeking. And public information and citizens' personal data became treated as commodity for commercial purposes. So, coming back to the role of the media in this whole process, what happened to the public sphere and the role of the media in coordinating competing societal interests? I would argue that there are three central factors that are important when critically analyzing the media today, and I remind again that when I speak about media, I mostly mean the factual media contents news journalism. First is the media's role in the processes of normalization concerning the changes in power relations and in dominant ideology. Stuart Hall wrote already in the 70s about the naturalization effect of the media. Today, this means that the way the media reports on the state of the world means that it normalizes the processes of, for example, increasing inequality, growing right-wing political influence, and the Brexit for that matter. On the screen of the mobile phone or in television, as well on the pages of a newspaper, these are things that just seem to happen in the world. They create us the framework of our normal everyday environment in which we continue to live. I give here a recent example. We conducted a comparative analysis of the media representations of the so-called refugee crisis in 3 Nordic countries in 2015. The report is still in the finalizing process to be published. The results show clearly that in the process, the concept of the crisis became normalized and naturalized. There is something in me. Thank you. The stereotypes concerning refugees as the other are much reinforced. The right-wing anti-refugees discourse became mainstreamed. It is not that the media representations as such necessarily offer moral or political arguments. The normalizing effect is embedded in the way how journalism works. instead of providing its audiences means to participate and engage in these processes, the mainstream media at its best report of the world, and in reporting it, journalism confirms the normality and naturalness of the things and the way they are in the world. Second, because of the increase in inequality, the consumption of the media is progressively polarizing too. This means that, as the present statistics show, even in the Nordic countries, there is today an enlightened and educated elite that enjoys the fact-based quality journalism versus an increasing number of population that consumes less and less news, media, and more entertainment-based contents. Recent statistics in Finland show that as the poorest income decile, or tenth, of society has in the last 10 years significantly decreased their consumption of the news media and increased their consumption on entertainment. The richest tenth has increased their news consumption more than their respective consumption on entertainment. The outcome from this seems to be a widening epistemic gap among citizens. There are two life worlds, increasingly apart from each other, with different concepts and differing understandings of the world. Third, as a result from this epistemic gap, the mainstream journalism has increasingly turned to its elite audience. What we see is that professional journalism, with its high standards of factuality and objectivity, starts increasingly follow the preferences of its decreasing numbers of elite readers and their ways of understanding the world, which then again alienates the other audience groups forming the majority of population. This again creates room for political populism that is used, among others, against the public service media. So this is a question of trust, or better, increasing distrust towards the media. That has been discussed also in this conference in other venues. From the Nordic viewpoint, there is really a reason for alarm, as in the recent global report in 2018 concerning the trust in media measured in 28 countries. The trust index in Sweden was only 32 on the scale from 1 to 100. The global average trust index was 43, and for example, Germany fared 42, USA 42, Italy 45. So all in all then, if the epistemic function of the media in the Nordic countries was previously based on servicing the social contract and balancing the conflicting or contesting interest in society, now their epistemic function has become more and more biased towards the commercial aims and thus serving the profit motives of the media owners. So the conclusion, would it be too strong to state that the mainstream media is today a part in the process of producing inequality? Now then, what should we learn from the Nordic experience? First, it is obvious that we cannot go back to the Nordic model as it was developed in the 60s and 70s. We shouldn't retreat into nostalgia. However, the democratic ideals that the model represents, equality, universalism, the public sphere, are naturally still valid and central to any European media reform movement. It seems increasingly obvious that in today's conditions, democratizing media and information systems cannot take place anymore on a national level. We need to think at least in the European scale and target our efforts towards the European Union. And I'm not thinking here what the Brexit might bring about to this aim. Despite the Brexit, in what follows, I will sketch out a proposal for a two-dimensional model for the analysis of the democratic functions on the media. First, I propose a distinction between 5 democratic functions of the media following the footsteps of Elihu Katz and others who served for the discussion on these themes already in the 70s and 80s. I don't go into details here, but propose that we can speak of the functions of the media in relation to our informational needs and wishes. So, as citizens and media users, we expect consciously or unconsciously. We accept the media offer us information, practical and factual knowledge that we need in our everyday life in the form of, for example, news journalism, weather reports, timetables, and so on. Orientation, the guidance we use to make our daily choices and value judgments, as in the form of interpretative articles, columns, editorial opinions, and so on. Social connection, media contents that enhance our membership in the community, such as religious programs, sports, associational life, and so on. Recreation, the services and activities we use for entertainment and self-improvement, movies, documentaries, educational contents, and self-expression. We have a need to have our voice heard and make our personality known, which means channels for participation and public engagement are needed, interactive programming, and so on. Now, we should ask how and to what degree the media today fulfill these functions, how factual, pluralistic, diverse, high quality, and interactive the media are in reality. So the question of equality then. In order the media being capable to fulfill its democratic functions, how equal are people today in relation to these functions? How equally citizens can actually act and use the media according to their needs and wishes. And here I propose that we can make a distinction between 5 kinds of citizens' communication and information rights that are necessary for democracy. First one is access. We need to have access to media networks, television, telephony, internet, print media, and so on. Second, availability. All relevant contents, information must be equally available for us all at reasonable cost. Third, competence. All citizens should have equal skills and competence to use media and communication according to their needs and wishes and those of fellow citizens too. And dialogue then. Citizens must be equal in relation to chances for self-expression and interaction, and to be heard and taken into account. And fifth, the privacy issue. The private life should be protected, and citizens should be able to choose themselves on the use of their private information. I can present here only this analytical framework. All these 5 rights actually are written in different kind of international agreements and contracts. But I mean, they are there dispersed. They are not forming any kind of logical entity there. This model, however, it has been actually been used already in practice. As our research group, the Helsinki Media Policy Research Group, we analyzed the state of the Finnish media policy in 2017 and 18. The first report was published last May, and the research book will be out in springtime, only in Finnish, for the time being at last. So there is not much time, so I can only show you an example how the matrix on communication rights can be visualized in practice. So this is a breakdown of the Finnish situation. So you see 3 columns. First one is equality in, and then are the rights there: access, availability, competence, dialogue, and privacy issues. So then is the situation. I mean, how is the state of the art in connection to these rights today? So there is a question of connectivity, for example, newspaper delivery, for example, all these things. Availability. What is there? I mean, what is the situation, actual situation, and so on. And then the barriers column means what are the barriers, what are the obstacles in realizing these rights today, what are the main things that are blocking the way for these rights. So this is just an example, a visualization how it goes. So I have to go to the concluding thoughts now. Just to sum up, what I argue is that we need a radical democratic reform of European media and information policy based on citizens' information and communication rights. If we are serious, this is not certainly an easy task, but will require extensive and well-planned collaboration on the European level between very diverse forces: the research community, civil society organizations and movements, politicians and of different denominations, public administrations, also progressive industry representatives. The aim should be at creating a joint platform and common program of action that would gather all these different forces into one big coalition. Also, we should be prepared to learn from the previous media reform movements. Some of us still remember, I believe, the WSIS, World Summit on Information Society, some 15 years ago, 2003, 2004, 2005, and the way how civil society was, despite all the careful planning, absorbed totally and sidelined by the corporate and state powers from the outcome of the summit. Do I believe this reform possible? I believe that it is a worthwhile effort if we are serious about democracy and the role of the media in and for democracy. I think the time is now much better and promising than it was a couple of years ago. Around Europe there is growing concern for democracy and citizens' rights. More and more people are looking for and are anxiously waiting for positive political initiatives. I will now end my presentation with an advertisement. In a few months' time, a new book will come out that continues and also goes a little deeper to the themes that I here addressed. This is a book by the Euromedia Research Group titled Digital Media Inequalities, Policies Against Divides, Distrust and Discrimination, which is edited by Joseph Trappel, published by Nordicom, out in spring 2019. I would be very glad to hear your comments and answer to your questions now. Many thanks for listening.
Thank you for this fascinating talk, Hannu, and some very interesting ideas, which I think ring a bell with many of us here in the room in different contexts. So we're now opening the floor for questions or comments. Yeah, we've got one there in the back. Just wait for the microphone, please. There you go. It's with you now.
You spoke a lot about citizens' private information, and you seem to put that up quite high, but the evidence suggests, I'm thinking specifically of the recent Facebook incidences, that users of those kinds of services don't seem to really care how their data is used because they haven't migrated away from them.
Migrated away from, sorry?
Migrated away from the social network platforms.
Okay. So this was an observation or odd question, all right. I think that the problem is that the technology is leading us. It is not technology which is not, how to say, it is designed for a certain kind of communication. And it's inviting certain kind of communication too. And certainly these social networks and Facebook and so, they are not designed for democratic communication. So this is what is the problem here. So they are designed for totally different purposes. So we are this kind of algorithm-based world is not democratic, and this is the question: who is accountable here? So this is one problem, big problem, increasing problem, I think.
Thank you, Hannu. Do we have any other question, comment? If not, I'll take advantage as a chair and have one question. So you talked a lot about reforming the normative model, and I'm wondering, how do we reform the way we think about this in academia? Because, as you mentioned on many occasions, is that we still hold very dearly to that classic model that might be a little bit outdated.
I think what we are missing is really an updated understanding of democracy. As I think Professor Schlesinger also raised it up the question of the new kind of the return of nation, if you like, new understanding of the importance of nations when thinking about Europe. And I think this is something that we should think much more about. Democracy actually was designed for nation states. Democracy was designed not for European level or between the states. So the whole system of democracy means accountable on the national level. And it is very difficult to understand. As many of you know, we have quite many years we spoke about the European public sphere. It was sponsored by the European Union and so on, but it is 10 years ago. I think we all then eventually realized that we have to settle first the question of democracy. What is democracy about? And I think we are still on that page, on the stage there. And I think it is partly answer to your question, at least.
Absolutely. On that note, I would really like to thank Hannu for coming all the way from Finland to lovely Scotland and giving us this wonderful final keynote speech. Thank you very much, Hannu.
Thank you.